Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker is.
Well, thank you for the invitation. This is quite a crowd. I wasn't expecting quite this much, but glad that you all could come. The museum itself, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background because we're museum people. You're museum people or you wouldn't be here. And how important they are to American society and basically valuing what's going on before us, the history, and to realize where we are now and where we've come from. The museum's been in existence for around 35 years or so and has grown into a local, I would say a local little diamond in the rough. It is in the original freight house. Part of it is the original freight house, which was built around 1900. And part of the museum also are actually rail cars that are turned into part of the museum exhibits. So the balance is, as I walked through the Studebaker Museum when I got here today and saw everything that's so nicely done, fresh, new, nice carpeting, nice tiling. We're in a railroad depot, so if you do come to visit us, it is intended to look a little more rustic. So we do have some improvements we want to make, but it is a fine balance between making it modernized and also keeping that rustic look that makes it feel so authentic to rail enthusiasts. And some people ask, why Elkhart? Why is there a New York Central Railroad Museum in Elkhart? In fact, one person on our Facebook page said, wow, it's New York Central, why is it in New York? Well, the New York Central spanned many, many states. And as was stated earlier, one of the largest railroads in the U.S. for quite some time. How it really ended up in Elkhart was it just kind of happened. And Elkhart being a central, I guess, stopping point for the New York Central, and you'll find out a little bit more when Steve and Dave come up to talk how important Elkhart was to the New York Central, and the fact that, number one, they had roundhouses there, a full shop building. They could actually build, construct, and repair steam locomotives in the day. I read one place at one time, just the locomotive shops employed 900 people. So this area in Elkhart specifically was built because of the railroad. In fact, Elkhart, Osceola, Mishawaka, South Bend were all built primarily because of rail. There we go. All right. Is that better? Yeah. I can hear it. Okay. All right. Great. A little bit about the museum itself. We're located right on Main Street in Elkhart, 721 South Main. It's not hard to find because if you're on Main Street and you cross the railroad tracks, we're right there, right alongside the rails. So the main line of Norfolk Southern runs right past the museum. It's a nice thing to have a railroad museum near railroad tracks because a lot of people come, some people just come to do photography. So it's a nice location. Have any of you been, raise your hand if you actually have been to the Railroad Museum? Wow. That's actually more than I thought. Wonderful. We'll come back again, and those who didn't raise their hand, get with it. That was said nicely. We do have some brochures down here down front, which you, of course, will be welcome to take at the end of the talk today. We have an upcoming event on Saturday, a shameless little promo here. On Saturday, we have our annual fundraising event called Rockin' the Rails. We bring in some live bands, we have food trucks, we have games for the kids, and face painting. We even run our amusement train. It's a 2-foot gauge train that we have totally refurbished, and we'll run that all day on Saturday as well. So if that's something you'd like to do, come join us on Saturday. It runs from 11 to 5. Admission is only $5 per person, kids 6 and under are free, so it's very affordable for families. All right? Well, I'm going to turn most of the time over today to Steve and Dave, who have a little bit more background even than I do on not only museum, but also on railroads in general in this area, as they both come from railroad families. I think we'll start with Steve first. This is Steve Deinhart. He is actually one of our curators. He takes care of the model trains specifically. We have a very large O-scale layout, and that's what he basically takes care of.
Okay, my name is Steve Deinhart. My family started on the New York Central Railroad on or about 1915. My grandfather spent almost 40 years, and my father joined 1946, right after the war, and he spent about 40 years. So we do have a little bit of history. Grandfather started off in the locomotive shop. I'm not really sure what he did, but I know I did some plumbing in the house, and I found some mighty heavy, thick-walled pipe. And so it took 2 of us to carry it out of the house. So I got a feeling I know where it came from. But I take care of the trains in the back room, the toy trains, and of course I've got a basement full of them too. So that's kind of how I got started at the museum. They called me and in about 2000 and said, hey, come on down, we'd like to have you join. Well, so I went down to see what they had to offer, and the fellow in charge said, what are your interests? I said, well, I dabble in toy trains. Well, come with me. Well, I'm still there. So it was a total rebuild, but we had a magnificent donation in 2010, about $85,000 worth of toy trains, scenery, track, you name it. And the fellow stayed throughout the summer, and we had it up and running using most of his material that he had brought in from his home in Florida. So it's all on display as much as we can get on display, and we used as much of his stuff as we possibly could. So after about 3 years, we called it complete. And so anyways, the pictures you see here were found last winter, early this spring, at the museum in a box. And our young lady that does our cataloging happened to have them laying open on her desk. And I just walked by one Friday morning, and here's all these negatives in sleeves. They were 5 by 7, and they're all dated August 21st, 1919. They are 105 years old this week. So if they've ever been developed or shown, we have no idea. We have no idea where they came from. But we do feel that they were taken by a company photographer, because they are, as you can see, they are numbered and given the location. So we're going to start, there's about 52 of them, and we're going to take a quick swing through them. This particular building is still standing. There's two of them similar to this. It's in a recycling plant. And they are using it and what they call the fire-up shop for the locomotives that they built. So we'll start going through these and see what all, it's phenomenal, the amount of stuff that was in that yard. I remember the roundhouses. When my father took me down there, I'd go to work with him. And I remember at least 2 stalls of the roundhouses that were left standing. And it wasn't long after that they were gone. Totally. But this building has survived, and as you can see, vintage cars. This is the Master Mechanic's drafting office. And again, where actually some of these were located, we don't know. But we've got, the general area. Most of it would have been on the north side of the tracks. On the south side of the tracks, we had 2 roundhouses, coaling docks, water tanks, and ash pits. But I think most of the buildings were on the north side. This is one of the turntables, the passenger engine house. And one thing that we've noticed that we have not seen before is the steel diaphragm on the back of the tenders. We surmise that in this time period is when they were changing over from the wooden passenger cars, which had platforms at both ends, to the newer steel ones that had vestibules. And this would butt up against the vestibule, probably to keep water and ash and dust from the tender from blowing back into the train. But these pictures are the first ones to show us that diaphragm built right on the back of the tenders. And we can see a few more of them here. We were even used in the freight roundhouse. This is the foundry, which was located again on the north side, just off of the end of the assembly plant. This one here, there was a 3rd roundhouse. This one was built in 1864, and it was on the north side, just a little ways from that first storage house that I showed you. From what I was told, the signal department, somewhere in the 1930s and 40s, took it over and was using it for storage and for their equipment. Again, the dry kiln for their wood. You can see some of the hand workings for their pump carts and wheels. They built their own track inspection stuff here. And of course the toilet house. This was the stockyards that were located just off of the end, just west of the museum where we are now. The tall building in the center was the end wall of part of the museum. Cattle cars would be unloaded. The cattle or hogs, whatever they were transporting, would be fed, watered, and then put back on the train. Probably headed into Chicago. This was the hose where they built their hoses and their bicycle shed. There's a lot of, at least around Elkhart, on the north side of the yards, it was an all Italian neighborhood. South side of the yards was all German. So everybody just, rode their bikes into work or walked into work. It was all close by. One of the supply houses, horse-drawn carriage. wagon being unloaded is for Monon and Pennsylvania wooden boxcar. Again, here's a big close-up of that diaphragm on the back of the tender. All right, this is one of our smokestacks. Between the two roundhouses was a power plant. Over by on the north side, there was a power plant also for the assembly plant. It had two smokestacks. All right, just another storehouse and scrap bin. This is part of where the museum is located. The front building and the middle building are still standing. That's where we're at now. The back portion burned down in 1949. And if you look at the end wall of the building, you can still see where it was attached. All right, here's the coal bins and coal sheds and coke bin. So, used for their foundry. This is the Tyler Street. This is the Elkhart Depot. You can see another vintage auto down in the corner. And here we go again with the, all right, this looks like the power plant between the engine house, the boiler house. We had about 3 large smokestacks within the yard. And this is part of the freight station that burned down in 49. Transformer house and bolt shed. And again, more storage and scrap bins. This is the boiler house, the west end. Again, the smokestacks. This was a transfer table. On the north side, where they built the locomotives, there was a long building, and you can see it in the one photograph here. The transfer table ran the full length of that building. And as they completed the tender or whatever, they rolled it out onto the transfer table and move it down to wherever they wanted to take it. This whole apparatus was taken down in 1940. Again, the smokestack between the roundhouses. And this is the track side of the Elkhart Depot. The far end of it was the Railway Express office. In 1955, when they built the Benham Avenue underpass, that was taken down. The underpass went right under it. And we're back to the roundhouses. Carpenter shops. You can see the smokestacks, some of which were used in cabooses, others were used in just some of the trackside buildings. Blacksmith's office. The ice house. They had reefers that would come in the west, and they had a gantry way outside the ice house. They'd pull the reefers alongside, open the hatches on the roof, slide huge blocks of ice down in, and as the train was in motion, the air moving across the ice kept everything inside cold. Machine shops, again out at the east end of the yard. Some of these buildings may be standing as they were attached to the main facility for manufacturing steam locomotives. And this is their power plant on that side. the bicycle shop, or the sheds for the bicycles, and you can see a number of vintage cars around. Air and hoist and machine shops on the south and east side. Machine shops and truck sheds. Of course, the trucks being the wheel sets for the locomotives. The boiler in the iron house. Steel rail. Not quite sure just where they would use their steel rail, whether it was for the track department or in the construction of the locomotive. Again, carpenter shops, you can see the stoves sitting outside that were either for cabooses or their trackside buildings or offices. Bolt barrel, storehouse, another storehouse. This is oil shed and platform. Again, steel rail. Foundry. Had quite a facility here. Looks like an old truck sitting right at the end of the dock. Again, we're back to the roundhouses. This is the master mechanic's office. Oil house at the west end. The paint shops. The locomotive inspection office. You see, might be portions of the boilers out here. The hoist house, not quite sure what that was. A good picture of a steam locomotive sitting at the passenger engine house. They would always keep out in front of the depot, there was a track called the coach track. They would always keep extra coaches there in case they had to add them onto a train. They always kept an extra engines around because sometimes some of the trains coming in from the east, they'd have to switch the engines out. They'd have one there waiting, take the engine off the main, bring the other one out and put him on. Take it the rest of the way. Back to the bicycle shops. Shed. Okay. We're back now to repeat. So, anyways, I think this may have been the first time these slides or negatives have ever been out of the box. I don't know. But there's a lot of things like this diaphragm that we've never seen before. So, in front, let's see if I can find it. Okay, here we start. The engine house that was built during the Civil War sat this way from the storehouse. Out in front of that old roundhouse, there were some tracks that led down towards the depot. And they were called dead tracks. And one evening in February, I don't know what year it was, 54, 55, something like that. My dad took me to work with it. And we had to go back down west of this building to where some of the smaller shops that had been attached to the large assembly plant were still standing, still being used. In his shop were 2 large boilers and 2 huge air compressors. These things had like 12 or 14 foot flywheels on them. And you never knew when they would come on. And I'd always hug the outside wall. When that thing came on, I'm telling you, the building shook. But after we were done, the boiler supplied heat to the depot, and he had to restart one. But after we were done, he took me down to these dead tracks. And I don't know how many there were, but I can still see it in my mind's eye, the steam engines that were all coupled together, the white line through the numbers. They were headed for the scrapyard. And there were 2 tracks, both of them were loaded with steam engines. And I wish Dad had his camera with him, but we didn't. So, but that pretty much what went on in Elkhart. The last steam locomotive to be built in Elkhart was in 1936. We have a small picture of it down here. Now, I'm not sure if my grandfather's in that picture or not, but it ended their production there, and 4 years later they tore the whole thing down. So, but the roundhouses stayed operational up through the early 50s, and by 56 or 57 they were all gone. So they didn't, Coaling Dock came down a little before that, in the mid-50s. And that was just west. They had a, what they called the 10th Street crossing. And it ran from Indiana Avenue across. It was just a footpath. But they still had stop signs out there, watch for trains and that sort. But just east of the crossing was the coaling towers. And just inside the coaling towers, they had their water treatment plant. And we found, I think Brent found a picture online this morning of the 2 big tanks that, where they stored their water and treated it before they put it into the boilers, the steam engines. Well, that's about all I've got.
I hope it won't be
Yeah. I'll just hold this temporarily because I'll give this to Dave. We'll get the next speaker. Steve talked off and on about the roundhouses. Of course, the roundhouses were so important in the steam era. And when they transitioned from steam to diesel, totally in the mid-late 50s, of course, there's no need for those roundhouses. And they were torn down, but you can actually still go onto Google Maps. Google Elkhart, start to zoom in downtown, and then shade yourself a little bit south of the downtown district and a little bit west. And you can still see on the Google Maps, the arched pits are still on Google Maps. So you can see both of them actually, the passenger and the freight pits. They won't be there very long because right now they are cleaning that whole site up. The EPA is in there. You can about imagine the fact that, gee, the soil is contaminated. Back in those days, they didn't think so much about what went into the soil or into the water, and we know a lot more now than what we did back then. So it is getting cleaned up, and my guess is when they clean up the soil, the pits will probably also disappear as well. I even had contacted a gentleman from the EPA. I said, well, I'd like to come out there and take some photographs for historical purposes. And it's not quite that easy. I have to get permission because the EPA is already out there. I have to talk to so-and-so and so-and-so, and offer your firstborn as a sacrifice. Because it is a super fun site and cleaning it up. The whole that section of Elkhart that we are in, we being the museum, is set for a lot of renovation. The other thing I wanted to highlight, of course, we're talking a lot about the shops and the facilities, and a lot of it has to do with the freight equipment and whatnot, but this was also a very important passenger route from the East Coast to Chicago. And the most famous passenger train in the United States is the 20th Century Limited that the New York Central ran on what they call their water level route, primarily because it ran along the Great Lakes and it was fairly flat. They didn't have to negotiate a lot of mountainous regions. Elkhart was a key stop on that water level route and was an actual stop for the 20th Century Limited. Coming out of Chicago, from what I read, it might have been the first stop. And of course, in the steam era, you had to stop several times, not so much to take on or leave passengers off, but to do engine maintenance. You had to either refill water or coal or whatever. They got away from the water tower idea on some of the main routes. They would actually put track pans between the rails. The rails are 4 feet, 8.5 inches apart. And they would put these steel track pans and fill them with water. And when the steam locomotive would come blasting through, there was a scooped portion underneath that locomotive. And it literally was scooping water up into the tender on the fly. They didn't have to stop, which is a pretty neat thing. There are some videos I've seen on this. If you are on Facebook, join or get on the New York Central Rail Fan Group Facebook page. In fact, the one photo Steve was telling you about that I saw this morning with those big water tanks was posted on that site. I've seen photos I've never seen before of people who were on that site, primarily a lot of course, my grandfather was an employee or my father was, and they have photos. And so they share them. It's a wonderful site. So I encourage you to do that. We do happen to have, speaking of the 20th Century Limited, we have the E8 diesel locomotive on our museum grounds that ran the last eastbound 20th Century Limited in December of 1967. So, and you can actually go into the cab, sit down and pretend you're the engineer. And yes, on the roof is a pull rope, and it does work. So we'll listen to it. Speaking of passenger things, we do have a conductor. At least it looks like a conductor. Dave Overton, who was a former curator at the museum for quite a few years. How many years it was?
I lost count. I don't know.
Lost count. Enough.
I've been there forever.
Yes.
One form or another.
He's now retired, but he comes and volunteers on occasion when we need him. So I'm going to turn the next portion over to Dave. And Dave's a good storyteller, and he's got some things to tell you as well. Dave, forward.
Well, thank you. First of all, someone asked me one time, is that uniform a real uniform? A complete original uniform. Yes, it is. A fellow that worked out of Indianapolis owned it. When he passed away, his wife sent it to us. I was looking through the uniforms we have one day. Wasn't much going on, I guess, so I was a little bored. And I started trying things on. This fits pretty good. Which means I'm a body double for a New York Central. Because uniforms are tailor-made to fit the employee that's going to wear them. So this was a live uniform. I'm the fake. But I got interested, not to my knowledge at the time, I guess, but in railroads when I was about that high. person. We lived on the south edge of Gary, and right next to a railroad track. And I used to stand in one room holding on to the windowsill, watching the trains go by. I was just fascinated. I also was chewing on the windowsill, which was probably lead paint, which may explain a few things. As I got older, and again, this is not something I remember specifically, but my dad was a motorman on the Gary streetcar system. Gary Railways. That's what they called it. Later on, as a teenager, I would catch the bus from Crown Point, where we lived, up to Gary on a Gary Railways bus. It never occurred to me that was a strange name for a bus line. And I found out later why, because they just never changed the name when they finally switched to buses. But my dad was a motorman, and I never really talked to him too much about it for some reason. But I did hear his tale of, there was a fellow that had the Sunday run down Broadway, the main drag of Gary. And he'd work holidays, he worked every Sunday, regardless, whatever other days he worked Sunday. Well, he had a funeral or wedding or something that he just had to go to. And my dad was going to take the run that day. Well, this fellow called him aside and says, listen, when you're filling in for me, I've been kind of keeping a little aside for myself from the fares. He says, so, if you put all the fares in the fare box, they're going to know there's something wrong. I'll be in trouble. He says, so, do me a favor, kind of help yourself. And my dad wasn't real crazy about the idea, but then again, he didn't want to get a fellow employee in trouble. So he put a little in his pocket instead of theirs. And he got called in Monday morning. And he thought, oh my God, I took too much. and they said, did the crowd seem to be bigger than normal yesterday? and he realized he didn't take enough. That guy was really helping himself. I asked him one time about when there was ice and snow on the rails, did that affect slowing down or stopping? He said, no, the streetcar is heavy enough, the metal to metal just crunches right through it, no problem. He said the real problem is when you're out on 45th Avenue, which was the residential area out south, and all the trees in the fall, all the wet leaves on the track, it's like operating on ice. He says you have to be real careful not to try and stop too fast. Start stopping way back because you just slide on those wet leaves. He said he had an accident. His only, so anybody told me that. There was another fellow that he talked to that was the only motorman that was ever able to keep the schedule. And he asked him, he says, how do you do that? He says, well, everyone got off the streetcar at the front. And he says, you got your hand on the brake lever, you're watching them get off, and as soon as the last foot starts to leave the step, bring the brake level around, which would release the brakes. Well, first it would do would be close the door, and you just continue on around and release the brakes, and then you switch over to the controller and put the juice to it, and you take off. He says, so you cut out a few seconds here and a few seconds there. So he thought, I'm gonna try that. And he did, and he said, yeah, it really worked pretty good. He says, one day I was concentrating on people getting off and had my hand on them. And they got off and I swung around and I started the controller and we started moving. But I hadn't noticed, as I was watching them, that car that went by didn't go by, it stopped in front of me. We pinned it between the streetcar and the trolley pole that stands in the middle of the street. He says, I didn't try that anymore. I decided I'd just be late. But I've been involved with the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, besides the group here in Goshen, or in Elkhart. I live in Goshen. And who have a steam engine similar to one we have at the museum, except that they restored to operating condition a number of years ago, before I was ever with them. And I served on many a passenger train excursion behind that engine. And once I discovered this uniform, and we got to talking about it at the museum, and I sort of have I don't know if it's really official, so Brent, be quiet, don't listen to what I'm saying. We sort of have an unofficial understanding that if I'm going to something that's benefiting or promoting railroad history or preservation or anything like that, I can wear the uniform. And I do. Or if some club group wants a speaker, they've asked me, and I can do that. As a result, the museum there really doesn't have a good place for changing clothes. So this hangs in my closet at home. And Brent knows, but we often refer to it as my uniform, but I know it's not. It belongs to the museum, and I take care of it. I get it cleaned quite often and make sure it's in good shape. But anyway, working with the Fort Wayne group and working on runs with passengers is interesting in more ways than one, as you can imagine. But it's really fun, and I've enjoyed it. I haven't been doing much lately, but then again, that goes and comes. But one thing I was going to mention, that a few years back, or several years now, we've spent one summer running somewhere a couple times a month. I mean, we just ran and ran and ran. And we had a weekend out in Pennsylvania, taking people around the big horseshoe curve out there.
Oh, yeah.
And then back. And we made a couple runs a day doing that, stopping at Altoona there's a museum, railroad museum there. But this involved the logistics of the thing. Our engine, therefore our train, was based in a yard east a ways from the horseshoe curve. We had to get up at 3 in the morning. Thank you very much. And the motel we were staying at opened up part of their kitchen to at least give us some food. Not the full truck of the menu, but still pretty good. And then we had our drive to the yard where our train was. And then about 45 minutes to go to where we picked up our passengers. And of course, we did the same thing when we dropped the passengers off. Had to get back to the yard, had to get back to we got in bed about 11 o'clock, up at 3, in bed at 11. Did it again the next day. We were all carpooling. We all kind of agreed we're not going to go home until tomorrow. We're not going to get up and after doing this. And I told them as we started out coming back, I say, you know, it's a good thing I'm a volunteer, because you couldn't pay me to work. But I've enjoyed it, and playing railroad, I admit I'm playing railroad. I'm a sort of amateur railroader. It was interesting being here at the museum. One of my many trips I used to take out west, I went to Fort Robinson State Park now, out in Nebraska, in the panhandle of Nebraska. It was back in the day, it was a cavalry remount station. When they needed new horses, the horses were collected there, and then if a unit needed new horses or a new horse or whatever, that's where they kept them. So this place got a bunch of barns. And first time I went there, I wasn't interested in doing that. I was more interested in the tracks, because actually there's a big horseshoe coupe out there that if you know how to get to it, it's kind of neat. But second time I went out there, I kind of looked around some more, and I went in one of the barns, and they had some of the old cavalry stuff. They also have a horse-drawn ambulance. I mean, it was a big wagon outfitted as an ambulance that pulled by horses. Manufactured by, how many guesses? Studebaker in South Bend, Indiana. 2,000-mile round trip to see something I should be able to see here. But I've enjoyed what I've been doing and learning a lot over the years. I was fortunate enough to be on the original committee that the city of Elkhart appointed to look into the possibility of having a railroad museum there. And we decided it was. Found out later it takes about 5 years to do that. We opened it in 5 months. But then again, we're just now getting it really good. So maybe we should have taken our time a little bit. So I hope we've entertained and informed you. And I think we have, this isn't a railroad watch, but it's a pocket watch, and I always have to wear it with a uniform. We've got some time here. If you want to ask us questions, or come up and look at some of the material up front.